Before the Mongols, war followed rules that had barely changed for centuries. Armies moved slowly, bound by roads, seasons, and supply lines. Battles were predictable. Kings gathered forces near cities, castles, and fertile land because stone walls and stored grain were the backbone of power. Heavy infantry marched in tight formations, armored knights dominated open fields, and victory usually belonged to whoever could raise the largest army and keep it fed the longest. Warfare was a contest of endurance more than intelligence. Commanders believed control came from standing at the center of the battlefield, banners raised high, shouting orders that rippled outward with delay and confusion. Information traveled slowly. Fear spread unevenly, and surprise was rare. Across Eurasia, civilizations believed themselves secure behind walls, mountains, and distance. China trusted its fortifications. Islamic empires relied on fortified cities and professional armies. European kingdoms believed dense forests and rivers would slow invaders. Everyone assumed that distance itself was protection. No army could move fast enough, strike deep enough, or coordinate widely enough to threaten the entire known world at once. They were wrong. Far from the cities, beyond the farms and roads, on the cold, open grasslands of Central Asia, a different relationship with war was forming. The steppe did not allow slowness, it punished hesitation. Life there demanded movement, awareness, and discipline from birth. Survival depended on reading the land, the sky, and the behavior of animals. On the steppe, children learned to ride before they learned to walk properly. They learned to shoot accurately from a moving horse, not as a military skill, but as a necessity of life. This environment produced not just warriors, but a mindset entirely alien to settled civilizations. In the late 12th century, this world gave rise to a man born with no crown, no army, and no protection. His name was Temujin. His early life was defined by betrayal, hunger, and constant danger. His father was poisoned. His clan abandoned him. As a child, he scavenged for food and learned that loyalty was fragile and power was temporary. These experiences did not make him cruel by accident. They taught him clarity. On the steppe, sentimentality was weakness, adaptability was survival. When Temujin began to unite the Mongol tribes, he did not rely on tradition or noble blood, he relied on ability. Men rose through the ranks because they were competent, disciplined, and loyal, not because of their family name. This alone was revolutionary, but it was only the beginning. Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, did not merely gather warriors, he reorganized the very concept of an army. He stripped warfare down to its fundamentals and rebuilt it around speed, intelligence, flexibility, and fear. Where other civilizations treated war as a seasonal activity, the Mongols treated it as a continuous state of readiness. Where others saw geography as an obstacle, the Mongols saw it as an opportunity. The first great transformation came with mobility. Before the Mongols, armies moved as fast as their slowest supply wagon. Food, armor, tents, and equipment dragged behind them in long, vulnerable lines. A single disruption could halt an entire campaign. The Mongols removed this weakness completely. Each warrior traveled light, each carried dried meat, fermented milk, and lived off their animals. Horses were not just transportation, they were survival itself. A Mongol warrior did not depend on supply lines, he carried his world with him. This allowed Mongol armies to move at speeds that shocked their enemies. While traditional armies covered perhaps 10 to 15 miles a day, Mongol forces could cover 50, sometimes even 100 miles. More importantly, they could do so repeatedly. Warriors rotated between multiple horses, allowing mounts to rest while the army continued forward. This was not simply faster movement, it shattered enemy expectations. Cities fell not because their walls were weak, but because help never arrived in time. Reinforcements were always too late. Allies were struck before messages could be delivered. Distance stopped being a defense. At the same time, Mongol warriors mastered firepower on the move. Their composite bows were marvels of engineering, built from wood, horn, and sinew, compact yet powerful. Unlike the longbows of Europe, which required space and stability, Mongol bows were designed for horseback use. A skilled archer could fire accurately in any direction while riding at full speed. This transformed the battlefield. Combat no longer required standing ground. The Mongols could attack while advancing, retreating, circling, or dispersing. They could harass enemies endlessly without committing to a direct clash. Traditional armies struggled to respond. Heavy infantry could not catch them. Cavalry trained for shock charges found no solid target. Formations broke under constant pressure. Armor, once a symbol of dominance, became a burden. Against Mongol arrows raining down from every direction, protection slowed movement and exhausted the wearer. Mobility defeated mass. But speed and archery alone did not explain Mongol dominance. Many nomadic cultures had cavalry, many used bows. What set the Mongols apart was how they thought. They understood that war was not just physical, it was psychological. One of their most devastating techniques was the feigned retreat. In most military traditions, retreat meant failure. Soldiers were taught to stand firm, to push forward, to break the enemy through courage and force. The Mongols exploited this belief mercilessly. They would engage briefly, then suddenly flee. To their enemies, this looked like victory. Commanders ordered pursuit. Discipline collapsed as soldiers broke formation, chasing what they believed was a defeated foe. Then the Mongols turned. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. Enemies, stretched out and disorganized, found themselves surrounded. Arrows fell from all sides. Escape routes vanished. Entire armies were destroyed, not because they were weaker, but because they reacted emotionally instead of strategically. This tactic changed warfare by proving something deeply unsettling. Bravery without discipline was fatal. Numbers without control were meaningless. Victory belonged to those who could manipulate perception. The Mongols refined this understanding further through command structure. Most medieval armies were rigid. Orders flowed from the top, and initiative was discouraged. If a commander fell, chaos followed. The Mongols rejected this model. Their army was divided into units with clear roles and objectives. Leaders were trained to act independently within the larger plan. Signals, flags, horns, and messengers coordinated movement, but decision-making was decentralized. This meant Mongol forces could adapt instantly. If conditions changed, units did not wait for new orders, they adjusted. If one commander was killed, another stepped in seamlessly. The army did not depend on a single mind, it functioned as a system. This flexibility allowed Mongol forces to fight across deserts, mountains, forests, and frozen plains with equal effectiveness. Geography no longer dictated strategy. Strategy adapted to geography. Perhaps most revolutionary of all was their use of intelligence. Before launching campaigns, Mongols gathered information obsessively. They sent scouts, spies, and diplomats. They learned languages. They studied political rivalries. They knew which cities hated their rulers, which generals were corrupt, which defenses were neglected. Often they knew more about their enemies than the enemies knew about themselves. Battles were decided long before arrows were fired. Cities that surrendered were spared. Cities that resisted were destroyed completely. This was not random cruelty, it was calculated terror. By making examples of resistance, the Mongols reduced future resistance. News traveled faster than armies. Entire regions surrendered without a fight, believing resistance to be pointless. Fear became a weapon. This psychological warfare was devastatingly effective. It minimized Mongol casualties while maximizing enemy collapse. The reputation of Mongol invincibility grew with each campaign. Armies hesitated. Cities debated surrender before a single scout appeared. War was being won in the minds of opponents. By the time Mongol armies reached the great civilizations of Eurasia, traditional warfare was already obsolete. Fortifications failed, massive armies fell apart. Kings and generals found that their training, their doctrines, and their assumptions no longer applied. The Mongols had not just introduced new tactics, they had changed the logic of war itself. Speed over strength, intelligence over numbers, discipline over courage, adaptability over tradition. The world was not prepared. And this was only the beginning. The shock of Mongol warfare did not come from a single battle or a single campaign. It came from repetition. Again and again, armies built on old assumptions collapsed when faced with a system that refused to fight on familiar terms. Every victory reinforced the same lesson. War was no longer about holding ground, but about controlling time, space, and perception. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Mongol warfare was their apparent chaos. To their enemies, Mongol attacks seemed unorganized, scattered, even reckless. Small groups appeared suddenly, struck quickly, then vanished. There were no visible battle lines, no formal challenges, no slow buildup. But this chaos was an illusion. Beneath it was a level of discipline rarely seen in pre-modern warfare. Mongol soldiers trained relentlessly. From childhood, riding and shooting were instinctive. Obedience was absolute, but not blind. Orders were precise, objectives were clear, and punishment for disobedience was severe. Desertion, looting without permission, or breaking formation could result in death. This harsh discipline allowed extraordinary freedom on the battlefield. Because each warrior knew his role perfectly, commanders could allow flexibility without losing control. This balance between discipline and independence was revolutionary. Most armies of the time relied on rigid formations because individual soldiers could not be trusted to act correctly on their own. The Mongols solved this problem by creating soldiers who could think, move, and fight independently while still serving a larger plan. This transformed the battlefield into a fluid environment where Mongol units flowed around enemies like water, exploiting every weakness. Another critical innovation was how the Mongols coordinated large-scale operations across vast distances. Traditional armies struggled to control forces beyond visual or messenger range. Campaigns were slow and linear. The Mongols operated on multiple axes simultaneously. Separate armies advanced hundreds of miles apart, striking different targets, yet timing their movements with astonishing precision. Enemies often believed they were facing a single force, only to discover they were surrounded by several armies converging from different directions. This was not coincidence, it was planning on a scale rarely attempted before. Routes were mapped, timelines were calculated, rendezvous points were established months in advance. Even if armies never met physically, they acted as parts of the same machine. This made defense nearly impossible. Cities prepared for attack from one direction, while destruction came from another. Relief forces marched toward battles that had already ended. The Mongols also redefined siege warfare. Nomadic armies were traditionally weak against fortified cities. The Mongols refused to accept this limitation. Instead of relying solely on brute force, they absorbed knowledge from conquered peoples. Engineers from China, Persia, and the Islamic world were integrated into Mongol armies. Siege engines, counterweight trebuchets, and advanced mining techniques were employed with ruthless efficiency. But technology alone was not the key. The Mongols used sieges as psychological operations. They offered clear choices: surrender and live, or resist and be annihilated. These were not empty threats. Cities that resisted were often destroyed entirely, their populations killed or enslaved. News of these actions spread rapidly. When the next city was approached, its leaders already knew the likely outcome of resistance. This approach drastically reduced the need for prolonged sieges. Many cities opened their gates without a fight. This saved time, preserved Mongol forces, and allowed campaigns to continue without delay. War became faster, cheaper, and more decisive. Another overlooked element of Mongol success was logistics. Most armies depended on long supply chains that were vulnerable to disruption. The Mongols eliminated this weakness. Their lifestyle allowed them to operate without fixed bases. They carried minimal equipment, lived off their herds, and adapted to local resources. They could campaign in winter, cross deserts, and traverse mountains that other armies avoided entirely. This logistical independence allowed the Mongols to attack when and where enemies least expected. Winter campaigns were especially devastating. Rivers froze, allowing rapid movement. Defenders assumed campaigns would pause until spring. Instead, Mongol armies appeared at city gates when garrisons were understaffed and unprepared. Equally important was how the Mongols treated information. Communication within the empire was fast and reliable. A relay system of messengers allowed orders and intelligence to move quickly across thousands of miles. This meant successful tactics were rapidly shared and failures were analyzed and corrected. Warfare became a learning system, constantly improving. Enemies, by contrast, operated in isolation. One kingdom did not learn from another's defeat until it was too late. The Mongols exploited this gap relentlessly. They adapted faster than anyone else on the battlefield. As the Mongol Empire expanded, these methods spread across continents. Armies that survived encounters with the Mongols were forced to adapt. Heavy cavalry declined, fortifications were redesigned, intelligence gathering became more systematic, command structures slowly evolved toward flexibility. Even those who hated the Mongols learned from them because survival demanded it. The true measure of the Mongols' impact is not how many cities they destroyed, but how deeply they altered military thinking. After them, no serious commander could ignore mobility. No army could afford to neglect intelligence. No general could rely solely on numbers and courage. The Mongols proved that war was not won by tradition, but by adaptation. That lesson echoed long after their empire fragmented. It influenced Ottoman campaigns, Russian expansion, and even modern doctrines that prioritize speed, surprise, and decentralized command. By the time the Mongol tide began to recede, the world they had conquered was no longer the same. Borders had shifted, populations had moved, and trade routes had reopened under Mongol protection. But beneath these visible changes lay something deeper. The mental framework of warfare had been altered permanently. Armies would never again assume that walls guaranteed safety. Generals would never again underestimate speed, and fear, once an unpredictable force, had become something that could be engineered and controlled. The Mongols had shown the world that war was not just about fighting harder, but about thinking differently. And that realization was more dangerous than any army.
As Mongol campaigns pushed deeper into the heart of Eurasia, their enemies began to realize that what they faced was not simply a powerful army, but an entirely new system of warfare. Kingdoms rose and fell, not because their soldiers lacked courage, but because their leaders failed to understand the nature of the threat. The Mongols did not fight wars of attrition, they fought wars of collapse. Central to this was their understanding of command and control. In traditional armies, authority flowed downward in rigid lines. Orders were issued, delayed, misunderstood, or ignored. Confusion was common, especially once fighting began. The Mongols replaced this fragile structure with clarity. Every unit knew its objective before battle. Signals were standardized, roles were defined. Once the battle began, units did not wait for instructions, they executed the plan. This approach allowed Mongol armies to function even under extreme pressure. Dust, smoke, noise, and chaos did not paralyze them. While enemy forces struggled to maintain cohesion, Mongol units maneuvered freely, adjusting their positions with precision. They were not reacting blindly, they were following a design. One of the most important consequences of this system was resilience. Killing a Mongol commander did not stop the attack. Other leaders immediately took control. There was no single point of failure. This concept, nearly unknown in medieval warfare, is fundamental to modern military doctrine.
The Mongols understood centuries earlier that survival depended on redundancy and adaptability. Their use of intelligence deserves even deeper attention. The Mongols treated information as a strategic resource. Before an invasion, they gathered data relentlessly: geography, climate, political divisions, economic strength, religious tensions. Nothing was ignored. They exploited rivalries, bribed officials, and recruited defectors. Often they entered enemy territory already knowing which cities would resist and which would surrender. This knowledge shaped every decision. Routes were chosen not only for speed but for surprise. Attacks were timed to coincide with internal unrest. Enemy alliances were broken before battles were fought. When resistance collapsed suddenly, it was not because of overwhelming force alone, but because the Mongols had already dismantled the enemy's unity. They also understood deception. False intelligence was deliberately planted. Feigned weakness was displayed. Scouts allowed themselves to be seen, then vanished. Enemy commanders were manipulated into making the wrong decisions at the wrong time. The battlefield extended far beyond the clash of armies. It existed in rumors, expectations, and fear. Psychological pressure was constant. The Mongols rarely rushed into battle. They allowed fear to grow. Scouts appeared repeatedly, testing defenses, probing reactions. The enemy never knew when the real attack would come. This uncertainty exhausted defenders long before combat began. Morale weakened, discipline frayed. When the attack finally came, resistance was often already broken. The Mongols also perfected coordination between different arms of warfare. Cavalry, archers, engineers, and infantry auxiliaries operated together seamlessly. Siege warfare was integrated into field campaigns. Cities were isolated, supply routes cut, and relief forces destroyed before they could intervene. Each operation supported the next. Nothing was isolated. Everything was connected. What made this system so devastating was its consistency. The Mongols applied the same principles everywhere, adapting details to local conditions but never abandoning the core logic. Speed, intelligence, deception, discipline, and fear worked in China, Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe alike. Geography changed, opponents changed, results did not. As Mongol armies advanced westward, European forces encountered warfare unlike anything they had faced before. Knights trained for direct confrontation found themselves chasing shadows. Heavy armor slowed them down. Traditional formations collapsed under constant harassment. Attempts to force decisive battles failed repeatedly. The Mongols refused to fight on unfavorable terms. European chroniclers described Mongol attacks as unnatural, even demonic. This reaction reveals more about European expectations than Mongol methods. The Mongols were not violating the rules of war. They were exposing those rules as artificial limitations. They demonstrated that what Europeans considered honorable combat was strategically irrelevant. This cultural shock intensified Mongol psychological dominance. Enemies struggled to even describe what they were facing. Without a conceptual framework to understand Mongol warfare, resistance became confused and ineffective. Fear filled the gap where understanding should have been. Another critical aspect of Mongol success was their adaptability to technology. They were not inventors, but they were exceptional integrators. Any useful weapon, tactic, or technique encountered was adopted. Engineers were spared and employed. Artisans were relocated. Knowledge flowed into the Mongol system continuously. This made their armies increasingly sophisticated over time. Contrast this with many settled empires which resisted change due to tradition, bureaucracy, or pride. Innovation was slow. Authority was threatened by new ideas. The Mongols had no such constraints. Their loyalty was to effectiveness alone. If something worked, it was used. If it failed, it was discarded. This ruthless pragmatism allowed Mongol warfare to evolve rapidly. Each campaign made the next one deadlier.
enemies never faced the same Mongol army twice. By the time defensive measures were developed, the Mongols had already moved on to something new. The cumulative effect of all these elements was overwhelming. Entire regions collapsed not through prolonged resistance, but through sudden disintegration. Leadership failed, armies dissolved, populations fled. The Mongols did not need to occupy every city immediately. They destroyed the ability to resist. This approach fundamentally altered how power was understood. Control no longer depended on constant presence. Influence could be exerted through fear, reputation, and rapid punishment. The Mongols demonstrated that dominance did not require permanent occupation. It required credibility. By the mid-13th century, the consequences were undeniable. Military thinkers across Eurasia were forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Walls were not enough, numbers were not enough, courage was not enough. Warfare had entered a new era, one defined by systems rather than heroes. The Mongols had stripped war of romance. They exposed it as a contest of organization, intelligence, and will. This was not a temporary disruption, it was a permanent shift. And as the empire reached its greatest extent, the question was no longer how the Mongols fought, but whether anyone could ever truly fight like them again.
As the Mongol Empire expanded to its greatest size, its methods began to reshape not only battlefields but entire societies. Warfare was no longer a series of isolated clashes between armies. It became a force that reorganized politics, economics, and psychology on a continental scale. The Mongols understood that true victory did not come from winning battles alone, but from breaking the enemy's capacity to recover. One of the most profound ways they achieved this was through deliberate manipulation of fear. Fear, to the Mongols, was not a byproduct of war, it was a primary objective. Every action was designed to amplify reputation. Every punishment was public. Every mercy was conditional. They understood that humans respond more strongly to stories than statistics. A single destroyed city could pacify an entire region if its fate was widely known. This approach made resistance appear irrational. Leaders were forced into impossible choices. To fight meant likely annihilation. To surrender meant survival, but also submission. Many chose survival. From a Mongol perspective, this was efficiency. Wars ended faster, casualties were reduced on their side, control was achieved with minimal effort. This calculated use of terror has uncomfortable parallels in modern warfare. The concept of deterrence, the idea that overwhelming retaliation prevents resistance, rests on the same logic. The Mongols demonstrated this principle centuries before it was formalized. They showed that fear could substitute for force if applied consistently and credibly. Equally important was how the Mongols integrated conquest with administration. Contrary to popular belief, they did not seek constant destruction. They sought stability under their control. Once regions were subdued, trade was encouraged, laws were standardized, communication routes were protected. The famous Mongol relay system allowed information, goods, and officials to move rapidly across vast distances. This infrastructure supported military dominance by ensuring rapid response to rebellion or invasion. This combination of violence and order reinforced Mongol power. It sent a clear message: resistance brings destruction, cooperation brings security. Warfare became inseparable from governance. Military success fed political control, and political control reinforced military readiness. The Mongols also redefined the relationship between the army and the state. In many societies, armies were seasonal, temporary forces raised for specific campaigns. The Mongols maintained permanent readiness. Every adult male was a potential soldier. Training never stopped. This blurred the line between civilian and warrior life. The entire society was organized around mobility, discipline, and preparedness. This model gave the Mongols an enduring advantage. While other states demobilized after wars, losing experience and cohesion, the Mongols remained ready. Their military culture did not fade between campaigns, it intensified. Another key transformation lay in how the Mongols approached enemy leadership. Rather than focusing solely on defeating armies, they targeted decision-makers. Kings, princes, generals, and governors were hunted relentlessly. Leadership collapse often preceded military defeat. Without coordination, resistance fragmented. This focus on command disruption mirrors modern doctrines that prioritize leadership targets and communication networks. The Mongols also understood the value of timing. Attacks when launched when enemies were weakest, during internal conflict, economic strain, or seasonal vulnerability. They rarely attacked united, prepared opponents unless necessary. Patience was a weapon. Waiting cost less than fighting. This strategic restraint contrasts sharply with the impulsive warfare common in many historical accounts. As Mongol influence spread outwards, its effects rippled over. States that survived adapted. They improved intelligence networks. They reorganized armies for mobility. They experimented with flexible command structures. These changes did not happen overnight, but they marked a clear shift away from rigid medieval warfare. The Mongols forced innovation simply by existing. Yet, for all their brilliance, the Mongols were not invincible. Their system depended on unity, discipline, and shared purpose. As the empire grew, maintaining these qualities became harder. Distance strained communication, cultural differences emerged, success bred complacency. Over time, the same adaptability that fueled expansion became diluted by administration and internal rivalry. Still, even as the Mongol Empire fragmented, its military legacy endured. Successor states inherited Mongol tactics and principles. The influence spread indirectly through trade, diplomacy, and conflict. European observers recorded Mongol methods with a mixture of fear and fascination. Military thinkers began to question old assumptions. Gradually, warfare evolved. The most enduring lesson was simple but transformative. War was not about strength alone, it was about systems. The Mongols built a system that integrated speed, intelligence, psychology, and logistics into a single coherent whole. Each element reinforced the others. Remove one and the system weakened, maintain all, and dominance followed. This systemic approach is the foundation of modern military thought. Combined arms warfare, mission-based command, intelligence-driven operations, and psychological pressure all trace their logic back to principles the Mongols applied instinctively. They did not write manuals, they demonstrated results. By the time the Mongol Empire receded into history, the world it left behind was fundamentally altered. Empires had fallen, trade routes had reopened, cultures had collided. But beneath these visible changes lay a deeper transformation. The idea of war itself had changed. Future generals would no longer assume that tradition guaranteed success. They would seek speed, flexibility, and information. They would understand that fear could be managed, that perception mattered, and that adaptability was the ultimate weapon. The Mongols had shown what was possible when warfare was freed from convention, and the world would never fully return to what it had been before.
Long after the thunder of Mongol hooves faded, the consequences of their warfare continued to shape the world. Empires that rose in their shadow carried fragments of Mongol thinking into the future, sometimes consciously, often without realizing it. What endured was not Mongol rule itself, but the transformation of how power was exercised through force. In the centuries that followed, warfare increasingly favored mobility over mass. Armies that survived and adapted learned that speed could compensate for smaller numbers, that intelligence could neutralize stronger enemies, and that morale was as decisive as weapons. The Mongols had revealed these truths not through theory, but through undeniable results. As gunpowder spread and technology advanced, the surface of warfare changed, but its underlying logic did not. Cavalry eventually gave way to mechanized units. Horses were replaced by engines, bows were replaced by firearms, yet the principles remained the same. Rapid movement, flexible command, information superiority, psychological pressure. These were the true weapons the Mongols had perfected. Modern military doctrines reflect this inheritance clearly. The idea that commanders should define objectives rather than dictate every action mirrors Mongol decentralized command. The emphasis on disrupting enemy leadership and communication echoes Mongol targeting of decision-makers. The use of overwhelming force to create shock and collapse parallels Mongol psychological warfare. Even the concept of rapid, deep penetration into enemy territory has clear roots in Mongol operational thinking. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongols changed how victory itself was defined. Before them, victory often meant holding ground or defeating an army in open battle. After them, victory increasingly meant destroying the enemy's ability and will to resist. Control became psychological as much as physical. This shift fundamentally altered the relationship between war and politics. The Mongols also forced civilizations to confront uncomfortable realities about themselves. They exposed the fragility of rigid hierarchies. They demonstrated the dangers of complacency. They showed that tradition could be fatal when mistaken for strength. Many societies collapsed not because they were weak, but because they refused to change. This is why the Mongols remain so unsettling in historical memory. They were not simply conquerors, they were disruptors. They revealed that the world's greatest empires were vulnerable to an enemy that thought differently. They challenged assumptions that had gone unquestioned for centuries. Their legacy is therefore not confined to maps or monuments. It exists in ideas, in doctrines, in the silent assumptions that shape how wars are planned and fought, even today. Whenever an army prioritizes speed over size, intelligence over force, adaptability over tradition, it echoes the Mongol way of war. Yet there is another side to this legacy. The same methods that made the Mongols effective also made them feared and hated. Their calculated brutality left scars that endured for generations. Cities were erased, cultures were traumatized, entire populations were displaced. The efficiency of their warfare came at a profound human cost. This duality is inseparable from their impact. The Mongols demonstrated what was possible when war was optimized without restraint. They showed both the power and the danger of systems that prioritize results above all else. Their history forces us to confront a difficult truth. Effectiveness and morality do not always align. In this sense, the Mongols serve as both a model and a warning. They illustrate the heights that strategic brilliance can reach and the depths to which humanity can fall when fear becomes a tool and destruction a message. Their story resists simple judgment because it reflects the complexity of warfare itself. Why did Mongol tactics change warfare forever? Because they did not merely defeat enemies, they changed how enemies thought about defeat. They replaced predictability with uncertainty, rigidity with flexibility, and tradition with adaptation. They transformed war from a test of strength into a test of systems. Once that transformation occurred, it could not be undone. Every army since has had to reckon with the truths the Mongols exposed. That speed can overwhelm preparation, that intelligence can outweigh numbers, that fear can collapse resistance faster than force, and that the greatest advantage belongs not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. In the end, the Mongols did not conquer the world permanently. Their empire fractured, as all empires do, but the ideas they unleashed survived them. They moved forward through time, reshaping conflicts long after the Mongol banners disappeared from the horizon. That is their true conquest, not of land, but of warfare itself.